what I have written for the last 20 years are all in response to a challenge or a danger that is looming on the horizon, and which a famous American expert of international politics has called the clash of civilizations. So in all of the things I've tried to do, I'm responding in a way to Huntington's thesis and try to find alternative ways to overcome this clash of civilizations. Now, one of these alternative ways is what I called the promise of democracy. Now, by this I do not mean that democracy is imported from some countries in the West to some countries in the non-West. It is not a matter of putting democracy into some kind of a military invasion or some kind of indoctrination or manipulation. But the promises of democracy is precisely a situation where there is an absence of threat between people. In other words, the promise of democracy is one of non-coercion, of mutuality, of mutual recognition, of mutual freedom, of equality between partners. This is the promise of democracy. Now, we do not presently have such a democracy. We have a democracy which is very unequal, where we have people who are very, very powerful and people who are very, very powerless. We have people who are very wealthy and people who are very poor. So we presently do not have a democracy in the sense that I have described it as a promise of democracy, which is one in which there's an absence of exploitation, an absence of domination. Now, in such a situation, there would not be a clash, because people would respect each other, nations would respect each other, would deal with each other on the basis of equality and mutual recognition. So this has been one strand, one direction in which my thinking has been going, and it surfaced in a book which I called The Promise of Democracy. Now, the other book is that I did a bit earlier, and which then was translated into Italian by Marsilio in Il Dialogo tra le Culture. There I relied more on the idea of dialogue. And this idea of dialogue is very much borrowed from recent philosophy, the philosophies of dialogue. Hans-Georg Gadamer is a famous philosopher who formulated the idea of dialogue. Martin Buber, idea of I-thou, dialogue. Mikhail Bakhtin, the Russian thinker. So there are many thinkers who are pointing in that direction of dialogue. Now, dialogue also is a situation of non-domination, of non-coercion. You can only have a dialogue if the partners of a dialogue recognize each other as equals, and take each other equally seriously, and respect each other. So that idea of dialogue is a response to, or an antidote to, the clash of civilizations again. This formulation, communicative rationality, actually stems from some thinkers with whom I am befriended and whom I in many ways appreciate, mainly Jürgen Habermas and Karl Otto Apel. They are my friends from many, many, many years, several decades, and they have introduced this notion of a communicative reason, a communicative rationality, as also an antidote to the clash of civilization. I do not particularly like this formulation because it puts too much emphasis on rationality. So it's a philosopher's discourse, All the religious elements and also the elements of feeling, of affection, are sort of blended out in this notion of a communicative rationality. This is why I appreciate it, but I do not share it. I do not use that term. I prefer the term dialogue. because a dialogue is much more open. You can dialogue in many, many different ways. If some people want to dialogue in the mode of communicative rationality, fine. But not all people would like to do that. So I have a broader notion of a dialogue which includes reason, but also includes feelings, affects, sensibility, and religious belief. So it's a broader conception of dialogue. If you take this notion of dialogue as a preferred mode of communication, which also includes religious dimension, then I clearly would say that Islam can be a partner of dialogue. Islam has to be a partner of dialogue because Islam shares with us a common world, and if we exclude Islam from our dialogue, we return to the idea of clash. There's only clash between us and Islam. So that is the basis of Islamophobia, So if we want to get away from the clash of civilization, and if we go to dialogue, then it's very clear we have to include Islam in dialogue. And that has been a major effort of many people. I have been involved in dialogue with Islam, I've been in Turkey with many people in dialogue. I've been in Iran, in Morocco, and in Egypt. So the dialogue among civilizations has to include religious communication, and especially in our day, Islam. In international, intercultural communication, religion plays a very crucial role. I would not say that all dialogue is religious dialogue. We have also other dimensions of dialogue where we, for instance, talk about commerce or business, where we talk about politics. But a great deal of the dialogue which is happening today in this world is of a religious character because there has been an upsurge of religion in many parts of the world, not only in Islam, but also in the Far East and also in the West. So everywhere there is a resurgence of a concern with religion and also a commitment to religion. And this has to be taken seriously. So the old model of Enlightenment rationality, and again that had been one of my disputes with Habermas, because he was very much wedded to Enlightenment rationality, has been my dispute that this does not cover precisely what is going on in the world today. We have to have a different type of thinking, which is not only Enlightenment rationality, but which includes human religious beliefs. Because what people do in a dialogue, they express their views, they express their ideas, they express their feelings, but the mode in which I think human life is most fully expressed is in art, in music, in painting, in architecture. This is where human beings express their view of the world. They imagine the world in a new way, in a creative way, and this is through art. So if I want to understand another culture, let's say, in my case, I have spent quite some time in India, so if I want to understand really Indian culture, I have to try to understand also Indian art. Perhaps the most difficult thing to understand in India is Indian music, because it's so different to our ears, So I had really to listen and listen and listen again and again in order to open my ears to the music, the Indian music, and little by little I came to understand. I came to open myself to this kind of art form. But then there are also other forms, painting, Indian sculptures. All of that is very important if you want to understand anything about India. you have to understand some of their art, and of course poetry. Very, very important. Very, very important. I spoke of the visual arts and other arts, but poetry, of course, the linguistic arts are also very, very important. If you want to understand really a culture very well, you have to understand some of their poetry. Now, some of the poetry may be religious, some not, or at least not overtly religious. Although I would say all poetry, all true poetry is at some level a religious poetry, because it's all a love. I mean, poetry ultimately deals with love, and love is to something eternal. So anyway, you have to understand something about religious and non-religious art. For instance, if you want to understand Russia, for instance, now I've tried to make some effort also to understand Russian culture. But I would say you cannot understand Russian culture if you do not have any way of relating to the Russian icons. In the case of Italy, you will never fully understand Italy if you don't know a little bit something, about Palestrina and Vivaldi and Verdi and all. Without this, you don't know Italy really. And of course also the literature, you have to know some Dante. So I think art to me is perhaps a privileged way, a privileged access to another culture. And so I very much would emphasize that any kind of dialogue among civilizations, as an antidote to the clash of civilizations, any kind of dialogue has to be also very much attentive to art in different cultures. And some of the art is religious explicitly, others not religious, not explicitly religious. But it's a gateway which opens our mind to really the soul of another culture, the soul, and that's where the people really are.